Hi Year 12, this is a continuation of how to design a reliable experiment. So now we've covered different types of data you can have and the different things you need to consider to make your data valid and useful. We're going to have a look at the bigger picture now, and we're going to have a look at different types of experiment that you can opt into. Now, I'm not going to say to you need to do this type of experiment because it does depend on what you choose to focus on, and there are pros and cons to all the different types as well. So you're going to need to make notes on the different types of experiment that I'll go through, and each one has got strengths and weaknesses. Can you make notes on those as well? Because in your methodology, you're going to need to discuss which type you chose and why. So why you think it had more strengths than limitations in the context of your study, and why you've discounted other approaches. Okay, so remember, based on yesterday, that we are looking to create a methodology that has one independent variable that we're controlling that we want to look at, limited extraneous variables, so things that we can't control that might influence our results. We want to try and limit those by controlling them. That made no sense. Let me start again. Limited extraneous variables, i.e. reducing the number of things that we cannot control. And then we need to try and limit the demand characteristics. So we need it to be as high as possible, which will create high ecological validity for our study. Okay, so first type of experiment is a controlled experiment. And that is when you decide everything. You're going to decide when it takes place, what time, who are the participants going to be, what are the circumstances going to be, etc. So, for example, 5 women and 5 men are selected to work together to build a tower in 2 single-sex groups, and their language is then analysed for similarities and differences. This is not something that would naturally happen in college at a lunchtime. I mean, maybe it would, just for fun. I don't know. But in this case, the student who did this experiment set it all up, controlled it, made sure there were limited variables, everything was controlled and designed by her. Now, obviously, you won't be able to do this because we can't get 5 females and 5 males into a room together, but you remember that this doesn't have to be in groups. You could decide to request video evidence or somebody to write you something, and you can collate it all together, and you can still do a controlled experiment from the comfort of your own home. So the reason why these are good experiments is because it's easier to replicate and do it more than once. So if you found the data lacking, or if you wanted to do it again, you easily could. Also, it allows you to very, very, very precisely control your variables because you've created everything yourself from scratch. You've set up the conditions for which this language is going to be used in. So you have a very clear cause and effect, which means your analysis is really straightforward and easy, because you don't have to consider, oh, but maybe that word was chosen because of this instead of this. So it's really nice for that reason. However, it's really artificial. So as we said before about low ecological validity, it has a very, very low score for ecological validity. It is very, very possible that you're going to have demand characteristics because they're aware they're being part of an investigation. You might have observer's paradox, and therefore you might have unnatural behaviour that doesn't affect reflect it. So what that means is you might not be able to apply your findings to real life and wider settings, and therefore, you know, the scope of what your study is useful for your study might not be as useful in terms of how much you can apply it to the wider world, in which case, why do it? So these are really the opposite of a natural experiment, which we'll get to in a minute. You've got really, really, really reliable data in terms of variables, but you've got really limited data in terms of, well, how much does this really reflect real life? Okay, so also, I've already said demand characteristics, but your bias could also influence the results, but I think that applies to everyone anyway, every single type of experiment. Right, field experiments are a nice middle ground when it comes to variables versus ecological validity. So this is where you don't do it in an artificial setting. Language is still being used in the normal environment that the participants would be in, but you're controlling the variable in some way. So you're being selective. So for example, and this is anything that's based on a published text. So the YouTube video one that we talked about yesterday for sexuality, language and sexuality, that would be a field experiment. You are just taking language that was produced in its natural environment, but you're creating the independent variable because you are selecting two heterosexual and two homosexual males. Okay. So again, if you're selecting tweets written by different genders, you're creating the independent variable, but those tweets were created in a natural setting. So a lot of you will end up doing field experiments, and they really are a good middle ground because it's more likely to reflect real life because of its natural setting, so therefore it's got higher ecological validity than a controlled experiment. There's less likelihood of demand characteristics because the participants may not know that they're being studied, especially if it's a published text. Obviously, they didn't write it thinking, oh, someone's going to use this one day for their NEA. If this is where, if you're going to go and record your mum and dad on Zoom to see if there's a difference in how they speak at work, well, then that's kind of, it's still a field experiment, but again, you might find that actually it has lower ecological validity if they're sat there with a phone recording them in front of them. If you could do it without them knowing, then that would be better, and it would actually increase the validity of your data. I would always tell them afterwards, just for ethical reasons, but also, or you can keep it anonymous as well, is another way of keeping it ethical. In the past, people have, not my students, but like, researchers, sat in a coffee shop and recorded people passing by all day long, and as long as that data stays anonymous, then it's okay. Limitation, there's less control over extraneous variables. So because you're not completely controlling it and it is a natural setting, it's possible that other things might influence your results. But this, I think, is a nice middle ground between variables and ecological validity. The opposite side of the scale then to a controlled experiment is a natural experiment, and this is where you just literally, this would be the coffee shop person, you just go into an environment, you listen to the language, you record the language, they have no idea that you're recording, you have no control over what happens, you've not really created anything about the situation, it's just completely natural. So this is where, if you recorded your parents without their knowledge, that would be a natural experiment because they have no idea. And as long as they're in a natural environment, I suppose it's a bit fieldy because you're choosing to record your parents, so you're kind of choosing a variable there. But I think it's very hard to do a purely natural experiment, especially in lockdown. Now, the strength of this, obviously, is that you've got the highest ecological validity you can possibly have. There's very little likelihood of demand characteristics because they don't even know they're being studied. The limitation is it might be very time consuming. You might not get any good data because there might be too many variables, or it might not go the way you planned or you hoped it would go because it's a natural experiment. You have to just go with what happens. So you might end up having to start again. You just have no control over the variables. So it's the opposite of a controlled experiment. This one is high ecological validity, poor control over variables. Controlled experiment is extreme control over variables, but very low ecological validity. And you need to decide what's more useful for your study. Okay, this is a great image that I got out of a book that the exam board recommends, which I've sadly left in school, which is very annoying. But I did have this scanned in. So this is a continuum of the different types of text or data that you can use and how natural it is. Okay, so your best kind of text to use or data to use if you want high ecological validity are texts that are not produced as part of research, so texts that already exist in the world. Then you might have participant observation where they're not aware that they're being recorded, so that seems quite natural. Discrete observation, where they could spot you, but if you're wearing sunglasses and a mat coat in the corner of your living room, they might just think, what's going on there? Over observation, where you literally put an audio or video equipment in front of them, that's obviously going to be slightly less natural. If you actually elicited behavior, means you've actually asked them to do something. So you've asked them to send you an email, you've asked them to send you some a video of them speaking such and such. Then the next step after that is interviews. Obviously, they're very aware that they're being interviewed, so they're going to change their language anyway. The fact that they might know what the investigation's looking for means they might succumb to demand characteristics, and so on and so on. So by the end, you've got closed questionnaires, which are obviously useless because people are just going to say yes or no to the questions, and you're not really going to get to see how language is used. Don't be afraid to think of using a questionnaire, though. It can be an interesting addition to your data of your transcript, to ask the participants, or if you have got participants, how they think the conversation went, or whatever your data is, how they think it went, because it's interesting to get knowledge of whether they were aware of what they were saying, or even find out reasons for why they chose certain language, so you don't have to speculate. So don't and you can always discount them if you don't get anything useful out of it, but there is a place for an open questionnaire in terms of enhancing your data. But remember, constraints, word count, etc. Okay, you don't need to write all of that out. I suppose it's just something to come back to and consider. So I'm on 11 minutes 45 here now, so I think it's worth maybe making a note of that if you want to come back and check. You can use this as well in your investigation and pinpoint where you're up to, and as a visual way of justifying your methodology. So I'll send you a copy of the picture. All right, so moving towards the conclusions now in terms of what all this means. This is a list of what you need to decide. So what I would do is I would write these down either in a Word document or on the left hand side of your page on a piece of paper, so that you can make notes on your answers as you go through and plan your methodology. So the first thing you need to decide is, are you going to prioritize having a high ecological validity, so highly focused on it being a natural set of data, or are you going to focus on controlling the variables? What matters more for your study? And that is up to you, what you think is going to be more important. Now, if you choose that controlling the variables is going to be more important, then you're probably going to need to use a controlled experiment or a field experiment. If you decide that high ecological validity is more important, then you're going to be needing field or natural. As I said before, be very cautious with natural. It's very hard in this current situation anyway, but I feel like field is a safe option because you can still control it in some way. So once you've decided what type of experiment you're going to conduct, and that involves you weighing up pros and cons and weighing up what's actually available to you, you're then going to think, well, what type of data am I going to collect? And you can go back to that image of that graph to help you out. And remember, you need to be able to analyze that data both quantitatively and qualitatively as well. Might be worth practicing spelling those words because they are a pain to spell. Okay, so once you've decided the data you're going to collect, you're going to think, how am I going to create a representative sample? Who is going to be involved in this data collection? Where is it going to come from? What variable you're going to introduce? Really, that's probably the first thing you're going to decide, because that's the thing you're investigating. You'll probably do that. Might have already done it based on the ideas generate a lesson. You're then going to need to just list all of the extraneous variables you can think of, and then tick off how many you can control and how you're going to do that. So if you go back to the example I gave on the language and sexuality YouTube study, there's a list of potential variables there, and that could be a nice starting point. So once you've ticked off the extraneous variables you can control, what are you still left with? What limitations do you still have? And are these acceptable? Are you still going to have a reliable study at the end of it? And don't throw any of this away, because this is all going to go into your analysis, into your methodology and your evaluations about how reliable your study is. So please keep everything safe. The last thing to consider is, are your decisions manageable? So when you've got all of these answers and you've looked at what you want to do, are you going to be able to do all that within the constraints of your study? So the main thing obviously to consider is lockdown, then the time available to you. I am hoping to get a first draft of these in by the summer, so that I can mark them over the summer for you. And then the word count, which is 2,000 words. Well, you're allowed 10% either side, so 2,200 maximum. Right, I'm now going to give you an example from idea to methodology, and so basically take you through an example of what I've just said. So again, you don't need to write this down, but if you want to make notes, you can, and it's just to give you an idea of the steps you're going to go through. So let's imagine we're going to investigate, this is my idea, to what extent do males adapt their language when a female is added to a WhatsApp group? So we're looking to see if males will adapt the language if a female is included in the conversation. Okay, so I have decided that I need to value high ecological validity over control of variables, because if the participants are constrained, the results are going to be pretty pointless, because we're looking at like how males speak naturally in their friends in a natural environment. It's not going to be very useful if I say to them, guys, I'm going to put you in this WhatsApp group and I'm going to add a female in 5 minutes, and then they say why, and I say I can't tell you. It's not going to go down very well or be very reliable. So I've decided I'm going to need a field or a natural experiment because I want to have high ecological validity. My independent variable is going to be the female who I'm going to add to the group. Now, the control of extraneous variables, this is where it gets a bit complicated. So I'm going to need the same males in the group before and after. Oh, that should say female, sorry, before the female is added. Now that's essential. If I didn't have the same males in the group before and after, or if I put it in a different group, it would just be pointless research. It wouldn't be very useful data at all. So that's essential. Ideally also though, I need the males to be speaking about the same topic before and after the female is added. Otherwise that's going to be quite a massive variable that's going to influence the language, and I won't be able to prove that it was because the female was added. It could be because the topic has changed. Now, how on earth am I going to do that? That is a question I'm going to shelve for now, and I'm going to come back to. I don't need all the males to be of the same age or regional background, because I'm not comparing the female to the males. So the males are not a variable I need to keep the same, because actually what I'm comparing is, does male X change his language when the female is added in? Does male Y change his language when the female is added in? Which means that as long as male Y doesn't change his age or regional background, etc., in the space between the female not being there and her being there, which is not going to happen, then I'm fine, because I'm comparing like for like. I'm comparing the same male before and after. And actually, it might give me some really interesting data, because it might help me it might even give me layers. It might be that younger boys are more likely to adapt the language than older boys, for example. So I think actually that's a really interesting thing to go for, and it might actually be a good variable to keep in. Right, so to conclude this, like especially this question here of how am I going to keep the topics the same? How is this literally physically going to work? I'm definitely going to need a field experiment, because I don't have a natural source of this. If I was to just look at conversations in WhatsApp groups that already exist, the chances of this setup being available, that there's a group with all boys where a female's added and then the conversation stays on the same topic, it's not going to be that there. I just don't think I'm going to be able to find it. So I'm going to have to create a WhatsApp group with 5 males, which is going to make my study manageable, from the same friendship group, so that they've already got some kind of rapport. They're not going to be stilted. And I want to see if they'll adapt how they speak to their friends in the presence of a female. Now, that's fine. However, this is the bit where it gets complicated and it gets a little bit tricky. I'm going to have to insert myself into this experiment, which is going to lower the ecological validity of my experiment. But I'm going to need to do that because if I'm setting up this WhatsApp group, they're going to, and I don't speak in it, they're going to be very confused. Now, for the sake of this, I'm now going to pretend that I am a male because given that I am female, I identify as female, if I'm in this group as a female, setting up the group and starting them up in a conversation, then there's already a female in the group. So it kind of makes my whole experiment pointless. So let's pretend now that I'm a male. So I'm going to set up the group with 5 of my friends and I'm going to start them off on a topic. And I'm going to, I don't know what topic, any topic. I'm going to leave them to discuss it until at least one contribution's been made from each participant. Now, if I didn't have that, then obviously that means that I wouldn't be able to actually compare the data for one of my males, and therefore it was pointless including them in the first place. Now, this is going to throw up other problems, and this is like the web that you end up creating in your methodology. It's very exciting. It's like a new problem that you have to solve, and then you solve that one, and then something else comes up. So hopefully you can see that one of the problems with this is that if I'm having to wait for each participant to speak, we've all got friends who never reply to WhatsApps. What if one of them takes 3 weeks to reply, or 2 weeks, or 1 week? You're going to need to decide at what point you'll just discount him. And this might be a reason to include more people in the conversation so that if some people don't talk, you've still got a good range of data. So it's about going through potential issues and coming up with potential solutions that you'll be happy with and you still think are valid. So once each person's responded, or I've given up on Jacob, who never replies, I am now going to add a female into the group, and I'm going to have to get involved again, and I'm going to have to ask for her thoughts on the same topic to try and make sure that the same topic continues. And ideally, in my ideal world, this is going to all happen in like 5 minutes. I'm going to have 5 minutes conversation with just males. I'm going to add the female, and then 5 more minutes of conversation with everybody involved. Probably won't work like that. So again, you have to think about potential issues. Now, the good thing with this experiment is, as long as you know enough people, if your first try doesn't give you very good data, you could try again with a different set of people. So once the female's entered, if the topic stays the same, then I'm going to be able to compare the language used by the males before and after the female enters the group, and it should be fairly reliable because it's the same context, same topic, same males, hopefully the same day. So summarising all that then, my limitations are going to be my own involvement, because really it's ideal if the researcher doesn't get involved. However, I'm not telling them it's an experiment, so my demand characteristics are still low and my ecological validity is still quite high, which I've just said. WhatsApp is a natural environment for them to be speaking in as well. This will be a representative sample to an extent. Obviously, it's limited in scope because I've only got 5 males, and I probably won't be able to get a range of ages or backgrounds from that. And I don't know, is it natural for a 10-year-old male to be in the same WhatsApp group as a 16-year-old male who are friends? I don't know, maybe a gaming community could work, I don't know. So my main concern at the moment, or like these are problems that I'm preempting, are what if the males don't talk after the female is added? Then you can certainly say that there's a difference in the language, but I'm going to have a real absence of data to analyse. That's not going to be very useful if they don't talk at all. That therefore could make it time consuming. I'm going to have to type up the transcripts, so I'm going to have to be careful about a cut-off point in terms of how long I leave it after the female is added. And then I can't control when they talk or where they are whilst they're participating. I won't know what mood they're in, how that might affect what their language is. So there's a lot of variables that you can't control when it comes to human beings, and that's a good thing because it's good we're not robots. So you might want to think of, it's just a case of like making a list of those things that you can think of and thinking of potential solutions. And all of this is going to go into your write-up, and you're going to end up with a really beautiful, solid, meaty methodology where you've thought about everything and you've got an answer for everything, and everything that you can't solve, you're just going to identify and say, this is a limitation I'm going to keep in mind when I do my analysis. And it'll be fab. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. I've decided then that all of those are acceptable limitations, and I'm going to go ahead and try and do my experiment in this way. All right, just some credit to simplepsychology.com because I used them to for a lot of the notes on the different types of experiment because they've got a really nice clear outline. If you want to go to the link, they also have a nice list of terminology at the bottom that might help you digest and get your heads around the terminology as well. Okay, so I realise that's a lot to take in, over the internet, making notes, not necessarily getting to discuss it. Please do come onto Microsoft Teams if you want to have a chat through any of the features or the terminology or different approaches, or you can always keep emailing me. I'll do another lesson tomorrow that's linked to investigation, and I kind of ideally would like you by the end of half term to be ready to come to me with a really good idea, a pinned down question, and a summary of what your methodology is going to be in terms of what decisions you've made. So that's what I want you to be aiming for. But of course, it's going to take some time. Let it digest in the back of your head. Read over your notes from yesterday and today. Go back to the ideas you had after last week and see if you can find something that all fits together. Okay, thanks guys. Bye.